I'm a storyteller. And I believe that stories have consequences. We should be careful with what stories we tell. I'm a storyteller who comes from Europe, and we're here at the Gen Europe gathering. And nearly 400 years ago in Europe, there was a man who told a story that went like this: I think, therefore I am. Sometimes stories are like spells. That story put a spell on the world. Part of that spell was that it said that all of the stuff that matters happens up here. One of the things I like about coming to these gatherings is that I know I'm in a space where I don't have to do work of getting people out of their heads and into the rest of them showing up in the room in the way I do at some of the places where I speak. There's another story that was told more recently by an Argentinian thinker called Walter Mignolo. He said, I think where I am. Whatever I say, whatever thoughts, ideas, stories I put into the world, they come from somewhere. He said, but because of that story that René Descartes put on the world 400 years ago, there have been a few countries in the world where it's been possible for people to speak not from where they are, but as if they were speaking from everywhere and nowhere. And those few countries, the few languages, like the one that I'm speaking to you now in, have put a spell on the world, and we're dealing with the consequences of that spell. And it seems to me that part of my work, coming from England, the country that birthed the Industrial Revolution, having made my life in Sweden, the country which in the 20th century thought of itself as the world's most modern country, a country whose pride in its own centrality is such that it can award Nobel Prizes where a group of Swedes sit in judgment over the literature of every language in the world and give out a prize each year. Part of my work is to speak from these places, knowing that I speak from where I am, not from everywhere and nowhere. Listening to all of the other voices speaking from other places, from other experiences that have been hidden from me because of the life that I've had. So it's in that spirit that I come, and I want to share some stories with you today. And most of these stories do come from Europe. And many of these stories come from places where people are still living under the spell that René Descartes put on the world 400 years ago. But I hope that together we'll use these stories to make an invitation, even maybe a challenge, for the work that you, some of you, can be a part of in the times around and ahead of us. And it starts with a story that I heard in the words of an Italian philosopher, Federico Campagna. I met Federico in London last year, and I told him what I thought I had heard between the lines of his words, because the way I tell it is not the way he tells it. And he smiled and he said, yes, you got it. What I heard was this: sometimes you are born into the ending of a world. This is a thing that happens. It has happened to others before you, in other times and places. Probably your ancestors were responsible for some of those earlier endings. But maybe this time the ending is coming to you. How do you tell, how do you notice that you were born into the ending of a world? Well, one sign of it is that the future no longer works. Because the future, in the ordinary sense that we speak of the future in our societies, involves a line that's drawn from the recent past through the present and on outwards in a trajectory of promise. And if you're at the end of a world, that no longer rings true. When politicians stand up and make speeches and try to mobilize people by talking about the future, it rings hollow. Because the ending of a world is the ending of a story. There isn't much of that story left. And maybe in such a time you notice that the politicians who are able to speak to many ordinary people within our societies no longer speak about the future. They speak about the past. They speak about making things great again. They speak about taking back control. And however much we rightly mistrust those politicians, the power in that kind of language reflects a truth of being at the end of the story of the world that we were born into. So Federico Campagna says, what's worth doing if it is your discernment that you were born into the ending of a world? He says, well, first, stop worrying about needing to make sense according to the logic of the world that is ending. And then, make good ruins. Because when worlds end, they don't just disappear. They don't vanish without trace. They leave ruins. Ruins are the fragments of what that world thought was real, what it thought mattered, the structures that it built. And so in a time of endings, part of the work is to break open those structures, to release the resources that are held within them so that they can be put to use to build something else. And I look around this room and I feel like I'm in the company of people who are fairly at ease with not worrying about making sense according to the logic of the world that is ending. Also, that some of you know exactly how hard it is to be navigating in the space between the world that is ending and the things that you're working to bring into being. And I'm here because I spend a lot of my time in very different spaces to this, with different groups of people, to tell you that more and more of those people out there who would never come to a gathering like this are arriving at the place where they need your help. They need your help to stop worrying about making sense according to the logic of the world that is ending, which includes finding practical solutions that help people escape from the need to make their lives make sense to that world in order to survive. And they need your help in breaking loose resources from within those existing systems to make good ruins, to make the fragments out of which we will build together worlds that we can't imagine yet. When I started writing this book at work in the ruins, I found myself going back to something I'd written 15 years ago, when Paul Kingsnorth and I wrote the Dark Mountain Manifesto. The line that people keep quoting back to me from it, right at the end, where we say, the end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world full stop. The end of the world as we know it is not the end of the world full stop. And it seems to me now that it's become increasingly urgent to help people understand that. Because if we can't tell the difference, if people who are making decisions, if people who are talking about climate change and the trouble we're in, can't tell the difference between the world as some of us have known it around here lately and the world in its largest sense, then what's going to happen is that in the name of saving the world, by which they mean the world as some of us have known it around here lately, more and more desperate acts will be taken. You'll see people trying to save the world as we've known it, as if they're saving the world. And that's where the desperate plans for geoengineering are going to come from. That's where the walls are going to be built against people who are being displaced by changing patterns of rain and heat across the world. So we desperately need to free people from the trap of thinking that the world as we've known it is all that is worth living for. We need to help people let go. So what I want to do now is to tell 3 stories about the cost of that letting go, the cost of that shift, for people who sit closer to the centers of power than most of us in these rooms do. And then 3 stories about what it looks like as that shift unfolds, as people begin to make the journey away from that into what some of us in this room know and are holding a lot of knowledge about, the possibility of other worlds worth living for. One New Year's Eve, in the middle of the last decade, I was at a party just a small party in a house in a nice suburb of a European capital city. I found myself talking to a man who worked as an advisor to a government minister, or maybe he worked at a think tank, or maybe he was an editor at a national newspaper. It doesn't really matter who he was. But someone had mentioned to him that I was a writer, and he was asking me about the things I was writing about, and as I started to tell him, he got more and more puzzled. Because I was saying, yeah, I'm trying to write about the cultural logic of progress and the way we've got trapped inside this story in which the world has to be a thing that's on this upward sloping curve, and everything that's ever existed has been pointing to the way that the richest among us today are living, and we need to share that with everybody else and keep on that track. And I said, that's become a prison for the imagination. It's not helping us. It doesn't make sense of the lives that many people, even in the rich countries, are living today. We need other stories. And he couldn't follow any of this, because in the world that he came from, progress wasn't a story or a cultural logic. It was a fact that could be proved with numbers on a chart. You've seen those charts. Hans Rosling used to be very good at telling that story. It's not that there's no truth in that story, it's that there's too much left out of it. The experience of too many people's lives are left out of it, and that story will not serve the world we're in now or the worlds that we're headed into. And he was having none of this. But because it was a small party and he was a friend of a friend, instead of just walking off and finding someone else to talk to, he stayed, bless him, around the kitchen table with me, trying to find something that we could both agree on. And here's the most interesting bit. His offer, his kind of baseline bid was, he said, well, okay, but surely you have to agree that it's a good thing that we don't all have to work on the land anymore. I learned something very important in that conversation. I learned that deep in the ideology around which modernity and Western societies have been organized, the ideology that has been exported to the rest of the world in the name of international development, is a belief that the helplessness of the world's richest people, the fact that not only do they not know how to grow food, they do not know anyone who knows how to grow food, they do not know where their food comes from, has been a source of pride. It's been represented as proof of how far we have come. And as I began about 5 or 6 years ago to find myself in some very strange conversations with people like that, insiders in the systems of the existing world, who had become deeply frightened about climate change, I realized that part of their fear, which they never put into words, was that they were frightened. Because that source of pride, that helplessness that they had previously narrated as pride, was becoming a source of fear. They were frightened about where the food was going to come from. But that fear was held here in the gut. And all the conversations about climate change were going on up here in the head. And so it wasn't being named clearly or looked at clearly. And so they were starting to come up with more and more desperate schemes about how we were going to fix climate change and feed ourselves in the future that we were headed into. And the fact that they didn't know how to grow food and had never met anyone who grew food didn't seem to stop them thinking they were the right people to come up with the schemes for how the world should be fed. And I started noticing how these schemes were playing out. I have a friend, Reed Wildermuth, who's a pagan political and spiritual theorist who lives in a little village in Luxembourg. He's a very interesting man. And at midsummer last year, he told this little story about something that had happened in his village. He said, the farmer who has the field that I see out of my bathroom window got some money, he got a grant to plant trees, to take this overgrazed pasture land and plant trees on it. And he said, at first I thought, oh, good, that's a good thing to happen for this piece of land. He said, but then I realized this farmer had been given the money to plant the trees, but there was no plan, there was no context, there was no living vision for how these trees were going to live and become a new ecosystem on this piece of land. And he said, and I realized that I was going to watch these trees die. And he said, I actually thought, can I come up with a scheme myself to go out and water them to help them, these saplings, stay alive? And he said, I realized that on my own, I wasn't going to manage to do it. So actually what he did out of that was he said, right, I have to get more involved in community where I am so that I'm together with people who are capable of tending to living things on the land in this place. But a few weeks after I heard that story from him, I was speaking to a group of people who work in the European Commission in Brussels. And I told them the story of Reed watching the trees die on the hillside outside his village. And I said, I'm sorry to say, but I'm willing to bet that the planting of those trees was fed back up into a spreadsheet for the project that funded them. But the dying of those trees was not. And this is why you cannot deal with the trouble that the world is in from spreadsheets, from up there, from schemes that are concocted in offices like yours. But what we have to do, and bless them, this group of people, they didn't say to me, oh, well, if the spreadsheet had been better designed, it would have worked. They were actually willing to sit in the grief of recognition of the failure of the ways of knowing and acting that their institutions have been based around. And I share that with you because I think it's important to know that even people sitting in offices like that are increasingly getting to that place of that grief. But there is a danger when people like that hit that grief, that sense that their ways of knowing and acting are not capable of responding to the trouble that the world is in. And that danger came into focus for me when one day my phone started buzzing with messages and lots of people were sending me the same article. It was an article by an American novelist called Jonathan Franzen. I think it was in the New Yorker magazine. The title of the article was, "What If We Stop Pretending?" It was a very pessimistic article about climate change. He was saying, what if we admit that we're not going to stop climate change or fix it, and all of our schemes and all of our COP meetings and so on are not getting us anywhere? And it went viral in the same way as the Uninhabitable Earth article had gone viral a year or two earlier. I think it's very telling that now and then when one of these mainstream publications publishes one of these dark, deeply pessimistic stories about climate change, they go viral. They spread incredibly widely amongst the kind of people who read those magazines and share stories from them. Very mainstream people, very urban people, very highly educated people have this deep underlying sense of despair, which articles like that speak to. The reason people were sending me that article was because the title of it was almost the same as something that I had written. Early in Dark Mountain, back in 2010, we were organizing a gathering a bit like this, and I gave the title to one of the days of the gathering, "What do we do after we stop pretending?" And a few months before the Jonathan Franzen article, I'd written a new essay that had the same title. My friend Charlotte Ducan wrote to Jonathan Franzen and said, you really should have credited Dougald when you wrote this article. He wrote back and he said, I have very strong feels about attributions, but honestly, I've never heard of the guy. I'm sure that is true, and he probably landed on similar words just by accident. But what's important is that there were two words that went missing between what I had written and what he wrote. Because I'd written, what do we do after we stop pretending? And what I realized is that for the people who write for magazines like that, who live in cities like New York or Brussels or Stockholm, who are often the people who are genuinely, sincerely, most aware of and alarmed about climate change, these are also the people who find it hardest to imagine that they would be able to do anything. And therefore hardest to imagine that there can be an after. And so in the stories they end up telling about climate change, there is a confusion between the end of the world that they have been educated for and have been winners within, and the end of everything worth living for. And that confusion is heartbreaking for them. The despair is genuine. But we desperately, desperately need to help people like that go on journeys into the humbling experience of, and I can think about this in my own life. I didn't learn to use the tools of a carpenter until I was in my 40s. And when I did, working alongside a master carpenter on the buildings at our school called Home in Östervåla, north of Uppsala, here in Sweden, there was a kind of heartbreak for me of why did no one teach me these things when I was young? Because I was good with words, I was good at passing exams, I was the kind of person who had all of the things that made for success within the world that is ending. And I've met lots of other people like that. I've met university professors who in their 40s or 50s are for the first time learning to look after livestock and being taken on the humbling of literally rolling around in the shit the first time you are responsible for looking after a cow. These are the journeys we need to help people come on and share together. And what excites me is that I am meeting more and more of those people, and they're starting to tell their stories in ways that begin to put that do and that after back into the story that gets told in the mainstream media about the trouble we're in and how the world is going to change in the times ahead. A wonderful example is a book by a journalist called Maura O'Connor, M.R. O'Connor. The book is called Ignition, Lighting Fires in a Burning World. And it's about her journey in North America, training and working as a wildland firefighter and controlled burn fire setter. Because most of the ecosystems across the North American continent are meant to burn. They're meant to burn regularly. That's part of how life works for the plants and trees and creatures that live within these ecosystems. Over thousands and thousands of years, the indigenous people of those lands were actively part of that process, setting the fires. And actually, in many places, the white settlers who came, who had often been displaced from their own lands in Europe, which is how they ended up getting co-opted into these colonial projects that, yes, did bring cultural genocide and horrors to the Americas, but some of them also learnt from the people that they were settling alongside. And so the fire practices were kept alive by the settlers as well as the native people in many parts of the United States and Canada into the beginning of the 20th century. But then the modern forestry science came along and said, oh, this is ignorant, uneducated, primitive people, these poor white people and these dirty native people who don't know better than to set fire to the forest because of their primitive instincts. Fire is destructive. We need to keep fire out of the forest. And for 100 years, that was the way that the forests were officially managed across most of North America. And now we have this nightmare scenario where that mismanagement of the forests in the name of science has combined with the effects of climate change to produce the horrific wildfires that we're seeing today. But the paradox is that actually what America needs is more fire of the right kind. And Maura tells this story beautifully using her skills as a journalist trained in New York. But what you can see as you read her book is that she's not just being a journalist observing all of this at arm's length. She's going through a kind of initiation by fire herself in the process of the book. And it's an initiation that takes her out of that dark place of climate despair into a new catching sight of the kind of work of getting back involved with land, getting back involved with all of the living creatures and systems and processes that we share it with, including fire, including the life of fire. And what's so powerful about it is she's working alongside people who are nothing like her, learning from and coming to love and respect people, some of whom are white, rural Americans who never went to college or university, probably didn't vote for the same person that she did in the last presidential election. And when you're working alongside each other on the front line of either fighting fires or setting fires, that stuff doesn't matter very much. And there are also people from native reservations who are part of this, who are bringing their stories of how their young men have been being locked up by the state for starting fires that were part of the attempt to keep their practices alive through generations when it was being made illegal. And they're working alongside these firefighters who've realized that it's not enough to fight fire. You also have to work creatively with fire. And they're working alongside scientists who've gone outside of the mainstream, the heavily funded science that fits the official forestry agenda. And you see the kinds of coalitions and collaborations and the kinds of, I always say, like my old friend Vinay Gupta says, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, I'm a conspiracy practitioner. And what you see in these encounters is the kind of conspiracy practice, because all conspiracy originally means is breathing together. We need to breathe together because, the toxic kind of conspiracy theory is what comes when we're not having the breathing together that we really need, the sharing of our stories and lives and experiences and different knowledges. And in Maura's book, you get this beautiful picture of people actually doing that on the ground, on the front line of ecosystems that need fire in order to live. It's a real picture of what it looks like to go on that journey into the doing after. And it comes from somebody who lives in the middle of New York and who went to a very good college and worked as a journalist writing for all of these high status publications. But we need these things for other reasons that are sadder and more urgent even than climate change. And this was brought home to me this spring in one of the online series that I teach with a school called Home. We have people from around the world who join us and gather repeatedly for a few weeks around these questions of the work of regrowing a living culture, around these stories and practices. And something very powerful happened in one of these sessions this spring, and it's a difficult story, but I'm going to share it with you because we need to be able to hold difficult stories. One of our friends, Madalena, who lives in a village in Portugal, who's been part of several of our series, spoke during one of these sessions this spring and shared something that had happened very recently in her village. It was a young man who she'd known for a few years who had struggled with addiction. And he'd got clean. And she said he was an incredibly beautiful, gifted young man. And he came back to the village and she said she'd never seen him in a better state. He'd got over his addiction. And he came back and he stayed there. And after about 2 weeks, he took his own life. And she said, and she was speaking from the middle of the process of their community holding this tragedy. She said, I realized that this beautiful young man had been unable to see that there was a world worth living for. And there are too many young people in our societies today who cannot see that there is a world worth living for. And there are two things that I see converging in this. One of them is the darkness of the weight of fear about climate change that is hanging over our cultures and that is particularly affecting the most sensitive and the most educated young people, the people who burn to do something, to contribute to a better world, and who are absorbing this story in which the end of the world as we know it becomes the end of everything. And the other side of it is that the ways of living that dominate our mainstream societies and the upbringings that many young people are having mean that even before we get to the uninhabitable earth, they are experiencing an increasingly uninhabitable world. And I think that the kinds of work that many of us here are involved in, the kinds of projects and places we're involved in, we are already, and we have a responsibility to be creating pockets of habitability within a world that often feels uninhabitable, not worth inhabiting, not worth staying alive for or bringing children into, for many brilliant, beautiful, bright young people today. I have another friend who we got to know through the school, Adam Wilson, who runs a farm that operates entirely in the gift economy in Keysville, just outside of Keysville, New York. And he runs a little school called the Peasantry School. And a few months ago, he wrote in his newsletter about a visitor that they'd had there, a young father, his family who'd just moved to the area. Once a month, they do these feasts at the farm, to which everybody is welcome. And this young father had come to the feast, and he was coming up to Adam and speaking to him. And he said, I didn't imagine this kind of thing could actually exist these days. I didn't imagine this kind of thing could actually exist these days. That's the voice of so many young people whose life experience has not given them any evidence that there is a world worth living for, a world worth inhabiting. Adam said, well, what is it? What are you noticing? And the young man thought for a moment and then said, it's like you all are creating an irony-free zone. And Adam said, do you mean people are being kind, generous, and authentic with one another? And the young man said, yeah, that's right. You got it. And I think everybody here knows what it's like to spend time in spaces, in zones, where people are being kind and generous and authentic with one another. And we also know all of the hard work that goes into creating and sustaining those kinds of spaces. And Adam, I was talking to him this week, and I said that I was coming here, and he said, I spent quite a bit of time when I was younger studying and working with ecovillages in America. And he said, one of the things that he found himself coming to after a while with some of the communities he was working with was an invitation to them. He said, many of your communities have been born as intentional communities. And this is an understandable thing. And he said, but the image that I began to have of the intentional community is it's like a circle of people who are holding hands, facing in, looking towards each other. And he said, what the world is calling for now is that we drop hands for a moment, and turn around to face outwards, and then hold hands again. And he said, do you know what I call that? I call that an attentional community. And I think that that's the invitation in a world where there are so many people, actually young and old, who have never experienced a world worth living for, where actually, even if tomorrow morning, I say this in the book, if tomorrow morning the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, turned around and said, guys, it's terribly embarrassing. We did our sums wrong. Turns out you can release as much CO2 as you want. Panic over. We'd still be in the same deep mess. We'd still have societies organized around a logic of progress that is actually a logic of extraction, that outsources the costs of the ways of living of the privileged onto everybody else, that ends everybody else's world and calls that progress in the name of this one singular arc that was meant to lead to the future. We have to turn our attention, and it's going to look differently for different people. You all know this. Within a living community, within a living culture, there are many different roles that people hold. They include the role of those who walk the edges, the traffickers between worlds. And we know that, and actually probably in circles like this, we're more at home with the more obviously shamanic version of that. Those who are the go-betweens between the human and the more than human, between the visible and the invisible, and we know how important that work is. There is also a side of that trafficking between worlds that is being the people who can walk between a space like this and an office in the European Commission in Brussels, or the city council, or the local rural municipality. And part of that is opening our hearts to the fact that there are human beings in all of those places, human beings who are living with the despair of the failure of the promises of their institutions, but also human beings who are already alive to and holding some of the knowledge of how to release resources from systems and structures that no longer work the way they used to in order to contribute to something that has a chance of working at all. And building those relationships with local governments, with the people inside as well as the people outside of existing systems. Part of what I'm here to tell you is that that is becoming more possible because of this journey that people have been on which is leading many of those insiders to a place of despair, but also means that there are people who are already open. Sometimes you will find yourselves knocking on an open door in a way that might not have been the case even 5 or 10 years ago. And we need to share our experiences and our stories about that, share what's working, share that information across networks like Jen, because that's part of what's going to be called for if things are going to turn out better than most people in our societies secretly fear they're going to turn out in the times around and ahead of us. And when I'm with you in a space like this, I can see how that becomes possible. Thank you. And please join me and Anna at 11:30 or exactly when it happens. But in the next set of sessions, we're going to be in here holding a circle for anyone who would like to talk more with us about the work we're doing and share your stories.